want to give you a heads up on what's left. We actually have 4 events left. That's all. We had to cancel the 6 p.m. event tonight. Predation Confronts the Decline with Robert Brenner. We'll reschedule that sometime in the future. But we are on tap again tomorrow at 1 p.m. The COVID Crisis and the Carceral State with Dan Berger, Elise Thorburn, Brett Story, J.M. Wong, Megan Ibarra, and Nikita Oliver. And at 5 p.m., we're very happy to have the editors of a new magazine called Spectre Journal, which I highly recommend. I'm a subscriber myself. And their panel is called The Ghosts of Marxism's Spectre Editors in Conversation on Crisis. And the idea behind it is devilishly simple. Everybody picks one quote from somewhere in the Marxist tradition on crisis, and they unpack it. So we get a chance to listen to Charlie Post, David McNally, Holly Lewis, Kate Dahl-Griffiths, Vanessa Wills, and Zachary Levinson. So that will be tomorrow at 5 p.m. And then on Sunday at 12 p.m., we have Borders and Contagion. We also have a June part of Red May, which is on Friday the 5th, and that will be after geoengineering. Dan Denver will interview Holly Jean Buck about her new book from Verso. I'm not quite sure of the time, but we will certainly put it on our website. So that's what's coming up. My last bit is, as always, to pitch for money. We need it. We needed to keep going. We needed to do next year's Red May, where we actually bring people to Seattle, as well as broadcasting on YouTube. So go to our website, www.redmayseattle.org, and give what you can, or go to YouTube or Red May TV on YouTube. There's a link at the description. And also sign up and subscribe to our YouTube group, because we've got 900 subscribers. When we get 1,000, we get real-time CC captions, so we can broadcast for the differentially abled. But enough of this. Let's move into the family, and it's abolishing right now. I want to introduce today's narrator, unemployment recipient, and independent scholar, Will McKeithen. Will, take it away.
Hey, everyone. Yeah, thank you so much to all the organizers, to Philip, to Sean, to Mahim, to everyone else who's been putting this together, and to all the speakers. And I think I'll echo a couple of the organizers who have said, like, this is something that I've been looking forward to for months. And so I'm very excited. So I'm just going to kick it off and turn it over to the speakers. We're going to have Kathi Weeks, and then Michelle O'Brien, and then Sarah Jaffe, and then Sophie Lewis. And then we'll have some time for questions amongst the panelists, and then time for Q&A from y'all on Facebook or YouTube or wherever. So yeah, I'll just turn it over to Kathi Weeks. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to try to just do this for 10 minutes or so and keep my time for myself. So I want to make 3 or 4 brief comments, or raise 3 or 4 topics of conversation. So I want to say something about the recent history of feminist family abolitionism, say something about what I mean by abolition, what I mean by the family, and then if we have time for something about what it would mean to have a dialectical family abolitionist project. So let me just say something first about the recent history of family abolitionism in US feminism. So the call to smash the family, as was quaintly put, was pretty common in the 1970s within radical feminist and then Marxist socialist feminist discourses. And they were trying to go after, again, family as a social institution and hegemonic ideology. for Marxist feminists in the 1970s, the family abolitionism was part of the critique of capitalism. It was seen as a necessary part of that larger critique of capitalism. So 1970s Marxist feminists insisted that Marxists needed a more expansive understanding of what a capitalist economy was that didn't just focus on the so-called productive economy of waged labor, but also examined how labor power was reproduced on a daily and generational basis. In order for someone to engage in the productive economy, they have to be fed, they have to be housed, right? So that they go back to work the next day, and you have to produce a new generation of workers and take care of the older generation that ages out of that system. And so a capitalist economy has to encompass both the system of production and what they call the system of reproduction. And the household has been a primary site, not the only site, but a primary site of this kind of reproductive labor. And this is Raina Rapp's formulation in the 1970s, is that the family is the way that most of us are recruited into households, right? So if the household is this site of cooperation for reproductive labor, the institution of the family is how many of us get recruited into household relations of cooperation, and how our roles and obligations to that household are determined. So that's what the family is. It's a kind of recruitment mechanism and a source of social bonding that brings people together in these household units. So this was the 1970s. In the 1980s, you get a dramatic shift in the feminist literature in the US on the family. And it's really amazing to kind of trace this. Faced with an incredible anti-feminist backlash, the rise of family values campaigns, among other things that happened in the 1980s, a lot of feminists renounce the early radical critique. And they're quite explicit about this in some ways. They say, this anti-family thing was not winning, feminists many friends, and we need to kind of tone it down. And it was quite clear that they needed to, and so instead of talking about smashing the family or abolishing it, they wanted to affirm the value of family diversity, right? So try to make the family a more inclusive kind of institution, right? Inclusive of some different forms, so single parents, for example, or gay and lesbian families, right? So it was this project of trading in the abolitionist critique for the affirmation of family inclusiveness and diversity. Okay, so, and since then, I think that's been the default position among US feminists. Again, not a wholesale critique of the family, but a kind of support of minor reforms and a more inclusive version of the traditional model. Okay. So, and what we're going to experiment with here, or I am, and I think we're all going to do this, is what a new kind of affirmation of family abolitionism would look like today. So what do I mean by abolition? As I understand it, and I'm kind of drawing on the prison abolitionist literature here, and particularly the work of Davis, there's two major thrusts of an abolitionist project. So the first is the focus on large social structures and systems. Right. So in the prison abolitionist literature, they're going after the prison industrial complex, not just particular kinds of prisons. Feminist family abolition targets the family as a social and economic institution, not families, each of which bears a different relationship to this family as it's juridically governed, legislative declared, socially prescribed, and ideologically defended. So they're going after the family, not particular families that are kind of situated with either more or less copacetic relationships to that ideal. So first of all, an abolitionist project scales up for a critique of a large social structure, right? The family as a structure, not particular families or this family or that family. Second, an abolitionist project refuses reform as an adequate remedy, right? And that's the birth of prison abolitionism, is saying that reform of the prison is not enough. And that's what the family abolitionists argue as well. So family abolitionism is an ambitious and long-term political project. It doesn't settle for better families or just with, more equal rights within families, but kind of levels a much more thoroughgoing critique of the institution and the imagination of wholesale alternatives. So my definition of the family. So the feminists in the 1980s who backed off on the radical abolitionist critique defined the family narrowly, right? So they defined it as a kind of white heterosexual model with a male wage earner and a non-wage housewife. And they said that that model was already destroyed by conditions in some ways, right? So that it no longer, like feminists don't even have a target anymore. They argued that that was the target's gone, let's all go home in some ways. And I agree that legibly or, legally or culturally legible family patterns have changed. But I think the essential components of the family paradigm continue. And I think there are three of them, or I imagine three of them. First of all is a privatized system of household-based social reproduction, right? So that's the first definition of the family, a privatized system of social reproduction. Second is the couple form. And third is the privileging of a kind of genetically centered kinship or biologically centered kinship. I'm not really sure which. So here I'm going to focus mostly on the first one because I think of that as the most important. And I think what the couple form and the privileging of biological centered kinship actually serve to support is that privatized system of social reproduction. In terms of I won't say much about the couple form or biologically centered kinship, but I mean, one of the things that they both do is to narrow our field of social relationships in a dramatic way. And that's why in a very famous book from the early 80s, Barrett and McIntosh named this the antisocial family. Right. So the family is this, and they're really talking about the nuclear family, regardless of who's involved, this small, fragile institution that, not surprisingly, erupts into violence as a result, where we're supposed to, have all of our needs for physical, social, and emotional sustenance met. And they argue that it, quote, sucks the juice out of everything around it, leaving other institutions stunted and distorted. And so, I mean, that's part of the critique of the couple form and that genetically centered kinship. It sort of, it makes other kinds of relationships less robust and seem to be less. But the key to the institution, as I see it, is the way it functions as a privatized system of social reproduction. So the family codes the reproductive labor that happens there, the care of ourselves, of an older generation, a younger generation, the care of the community, all of the kind of practices of care that are crucial to reproducing ourselves. The family codes it as its own responsibility for which it should not expect much in the way of economic support, social services, or time off waged work in order to complete. The privatization of care is what the family, I think, delivers. And I think it's of enormous benefit to capital because this caring labor is provided mostly free of charge, disproportionately by women in the moments left outside of income generating work. This is enormously beneficial for, I think, a capitalist system of production and reproduction. So as a result, the mere affirmation of family diversity is not enough, right? So the problem is not just that this family is historically a white family, a bourgeois family, a heteropatriarchal family, a settler family, right? The problem is also that it's a privatized site of social reproduction, and that's why it's so hard to dislodge, and that's the site of its functionality and why it keeps sort of perpetuating itself. So where am I? Let me just say one more point then. So a dialectical approach to the family and family abolitionism has to recognize the contradictions at the heart of the family in the US today, right? Because everything that I've said about the family doesn't mean that it's not a site of solidarity and it's not the source of pleasures and desires. It is those things too. And that's what I meant about this dialectical view. It's both and in many ways, right? It is at once a welcome sanctuary for many people and a trap. And that's what I think we have to hold together in some ways. More specifically, I think the institution of the nuclear family originated as a white settler bourgeois heterosexual and patriarchal institution. And it was then imposed by the state, society, and capital on the formerly enslaved indigenous peoples, waves of immigrants, right? But it has also served those groups as a kind of fence against the state and society and capital, a fence against a racist state and a racist society and racist capital in some ways, a space of refuge. So it was both imposed upon as a means of discipline, right? And a way to kind of normalize and to be able to judge negatively the hybrid family forms that result. It's a mechanism of discipline and homogenization and to privatize the labor that happens there. But it's also, for many people, a welcome refuge, right, from other kinds of, equally abominable sort of forces on the outside. And that's what I meant about the dialectical view. I think we have to hold both aspects of the current family together when we pursue this abolitionist critique. So that's me. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kathi. So now I'm going to turn it over to Michelle O'Brien.
Thank you, Will, and thank you, Kathi. I appreciate everyone who organized this panel and my fellow panelists whose work I really admire and appreciate. So we're asked to keep this short, so I'm going to start off and briefly summarize 2 recent articles I published on family abolition. I summarized them at greater length in previous panels in Readme, but I'm going to try to keep this very succinct, and then sketch the kind of implicit definition of family that I'm using in that work, and how this framework that I'm using, I think, helps move past some of the impasses in some of the debates on family abolition, particularly by its critics. And then if I have time, I'll talk at the end a little bit about why I think this framework is increasingly resonant with queers and feminists. So I published 2 articles in the last year. They both are online. The long one is in EndNotes, a communist journal, and it's a history of the demand to abolish the family, surveying its multiple meanings since the Communist Manifesto, looking at Marx and Engels seeking to abolish the family as an attack on bourgeois society, Kollontai looking to collectivize reproductive labor and produce gender equality, and then the attacks on the family in the 1960s and 70s by Black women, gay liberationists, radical feminists, some of what Kathi was referring to. And I offer a periodization of really seeing these multiple and very contradictory meanings of a critique of the family as embedded in the transformation of the working class family with communist development, and particularly the rise in the 1890s and fall in the 1960s and 70s of the viability of a male breadwinner family form for the upper tiers of the working class, and how that provides some leverage for making sense of these different meanings of the family. And then if the EndNotes piece is about the history of the term to abolish the family, the piece in Pinko, a gay communist journal I help edit, is about a potential future of its meaning. And there I argue that protest kitchens are one of many prefigurative institutions or practices that emerge in direct insurrections against the state, that collectivize reproductive labor, begin to break apart and reform different kinds of kinship bonds between people, and that they embody the potential of an unfolding, communizing revolutionary process that could replace the family with large-scale communes of a couple hundred people. So a block, a large apartment building, a cluster in a neighborhood, as the economic unit of consumption and day-to-day and generational reproduction. And then within that, people forming chosen families of whatever sort they'd like, but not as economic units. And I reference the work of Charles Fourier, a utopian socialist who envisions communes a little bit along these lines. Ultimately, in that essay, I consider family abolition as a means of collectivizing care or communizing care. So in both pieces, I'm really working with family primarily not as an ideological unit and not just as a normative institution and not just as a collection of legal practices, but actually the bundle of all the different sorts of personal relationships that mediate access to the wage for those unable to work for a period of time. So for children, elderly, many disabled people, many people who are out of work, people rely on their families in order to survive. And they might rely on some state benefits or some other institutions, but those are ultimately much smaller and impersonal in a certain sense. And then instead, people rely on direct personal relationships, often in the couple form, often parents, often children, but that can take a variety of different forms. And let's see here. So, and the family is an obstacle to human freedom, in part because it inherently bundles both necessary forms of care and an isolated propensity or capacity for violence and domination. Some of the forms of care that the family bundles together, that can be the daily laboring of personal or generational reproduction, a sharing of material resources, or an effective expression of genuine love and care. And it can be all of these things bundled together as a mediation for the wage. So this formulation is helpful for sort of trying to make sense or trying to face some of the critiques of family abolition. One is that it sees family abolition as the necessary restructuring of care to be more broadly available to people. So state services and commodity exchange are the two other ways that people manage to reproduce themselves outside of the family. And so the communist intervention, the call to abolish the family, in a way that it has not always been historically, necessarily requires confronting not only the family, but also the market institutions of wage labor and commodity exchange and the state institutions, the racial state. So framing these things in these terms helps resolve some conceptual impasses. One is talking about state violence. So particularly for communities of color, the many state practices and capital practices have an intense destructive impact on people's capacity to form effective caring bonds. And these include mass incarceration, borders and deportation, the family separation at the border, excessive use of child removal by child protective services. And these are, in this formulation, not at all forms of family abolition, that they are not generalizing of necessary forms of care and untangling them from their oppressive or dominating possibilities, but instead they're just directly undermining people's capacity to care for each other. Yeah, and as well, the increasing availability of commodity exchange, of commodity services to replace the family in our day-to-day lives is allowing people slightly more freedom in the choices they have about who they live with, but simultaneously at the cost of increasing domination on the impersonal dynamics of the market or an employer. This framing also helps think through or think about chosen family or non-traditional family or family inclusion, as Kathi referenced. So chosen family includes queer support networks, the many forms of kinship and support in working class African-American communities, many different extended immigrant support networks. And all of these, I would argue that they actually embody a yearning towards family abolition, a recognition that inherited, assumed, or rigidly biological notions of family are inadequate for the complexity of working class life, and a recognition that we may choose to depend on some people for our survival, but we don't need to accept these as relationships of abuse or domination. And they have an insight in the form of chosen family that could have a revolutionary counterpart, that a free society would maximize people's ability to form chosen kin relations and find creative creative and diverse ways of organizing childcare, elder care, sex, or companionship. However, as I envision it, a communist process of family abolition ultimately would need to not only transform and break through a sort of conventional normative, heteronormative family, white family system, but also transform the organization and distribution of resources and labor that require a chosen family as an economic unit. So organizing general production relations based on kin, even chosen kin, would ultimately be a disastrous cultish ethno-nationalism and really not in any way a form of freedom. So chosen family are currently a movement towards the abolition of family, but that movement can, and if we're pursuing a free society, really must continue towards restructuring of the distribution of social care beyond kin altogether. And so I think family abolition is really resonating with a lot of radical, queer, and feminist people right now in a way that it hasn't in the last few decades. I think some of that is really for some of the same reasons that a lot of people are turning to Marxism, thinking about the economic crisis, thinking about some of the muddled conceptual impasses in queer and feminist theory in the 1980s and 90s, despite their many innovations. I also think that family abolition resonates a lot with certain elements of commonly held trans experience. And so the rise of trans politics has sort of opened up thinking about family abolition. And then I, as the particular thinker that I am, like family abolition because it provides a way of getting some concrete material social analysis on thinking about gender and sexual freedom, which have such profound psychological and cultural dimensions that I think are actually quite challenging to theorize rigorously, despite decades and decades of people trying. And that sort of seeing the family as an evolving social institution that people are struggling against and through and within is a way of really trying to get much more sharp analytical traction than we've had in a little bit. And I am out of time, so thank you. I look forward to discussion.
Thank you, Michelle, so much. Thank you. So now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Jaffe.
Hi, me and George Michael here say hi because George Michael is the pop music patron saint of family abolition. So he is behind me. So I feel like I'm kind of the weird one out here. I'm a journalist. And I'm writing a book, which I will return to in a minute, but I wanted to start off because like a lot of people, I have not been able to think of much else other than the uprisings in Minneapolis that have now spread to other cities, including Louisville, on top of the 100,000 plus people just in this country who have died of coronavirus, and how to connect all of those things that I'm obsessing about to this thing that I'm supposed to be talking about right now. And the thing that I'm thinking about is the way that collective grief is a way of claiming relationships way beyond the family. It's a statement of kinship. I think about when I was in Ferguson reporting my first book, talking to young people from the movement, and that was the first time that I heard people call each other fam, which can be singular or plural, which I love. And the way that, of course, as Kathi and Michelle have already mentioned, this country's history has both imposed the family on and then devalued and destroyed the Black family. And so thinking about the way we can learn from people in the streets and the way they take care of each other to what a politics of collective care might look like. So I'm going to return to that towards the end, but the book that I'm writing has its first chapter. The book is called Work Won't Love You Back, which is not surprising to anybody on this panel. And the first chapter is about how the family is a workplace, how the family ethic and the work ethic, indeed, I quote Kathi on this in this chapter, were shaped together, and how we're still sort of stuck with this idea when people talk about work-life balance. They're mostly talking about balancing between paid work and more unpaid work at home. So in that chapter, I talk about a lot of history that I'm going to not talk about here. And then I come up to the welfare rights movement, which I also don't have time to talk about in the depth that it deserves here, but I do want to talk about a little bit because the women of the welfare rights movement, who were again Black women who had mostly been locked out of the welfare system up until the late 50s, early 60s, because of ideas about who was an appropriate mother, what kind of family was important enough to be valued by the state. They then created a movement to blow the whole system wide open and did a whole lot of good before they became the subject of a really vicious backlash. So aid to families with dependent children, the thing that we used to call welfare until Bill Clinton ended welfare as we know it, was a product of the New Deal, had its roots both in this idea that mother's main job was in the home, taking care of children, and also that people should go to work if at all possible. So there's always a tension at the heart of these programs. Means-tested social programs are the US's favorite thing, and they're terrible for this reason, and many others. So welfare recipients were subject in particular to scrutiny about whether they were deserving, and often subject to like midnight raids to see if, they were having sex or something. If there was a man around, of course, he should be supporting the family and the state should not have to pay for that. And the women of the National Welfare Rights Organization, pronounce it properly, Sarah, and its affiliates really rejected that whole idea that they should be surveilled and their relationships held up to scrutiny. They said that welfare was their right, that they had the right to parent without needing husbands, that they had the right to care for their children and anybody else that they were caring for as they saw fit. My dog wants to be heard in the background. I apologize if everybody can hear him panting. So the women of the National Welfare Rights Organization, in some cases, some reports say things like, marriage and its fixed rules and obligations was a means for domination more than a means for expressing love. Mothers for Adequate Welfare, one of these groups, favored, quote, responsibility toward other persons and freedom to whatever extent that responsibility allows, end quote, instead of a traditional family. Johnny Tillman, who was director of the National NWRO, wrote in an article for Ms. Magazine, welfare is like a super sexist marriage. You trade in a man for the man, but you can't divorce him if he treats you bad. He can divorce you, of course, cut you off anytime he wants. But in that case, he keeps the kids, not you. In ordinary marriage, sex is supposed to be for your husband. On AFDC, you're not supposed to have any sex at all. You give up control of your own body. So they probably would not have said that this was a politics of abolishing the family, but the groundwork that they provided was built on by the Wages for Housework movement and others. And it was an analysis that neither the workplace nor the family was a site of freedom at a time when feminists were sort of demanding the right to go to work as a way to be liberated from the work of the family. They were saying, nah. And they demanded a guaranteed income, and that guaranteed income, not in a way that we would perhaps want, but almost came to being in some fashion under Richard Nixon. So I always like to talk about this because we forget how quickly things have changed. So as Kathi was saying, they refused the idea of the privatized family, and they demanded public economic support for the way they wanted to live with their family of choice, however they wanted that to be. So welfare reform, of course, then comes along, cracks down on those demands, turns the welfare rights activist into the welfare queen, and Bill Clinton destroys the whole damn thing, including pumping some money that used to go into the pockets of low-income women into marriage promotion programs and funds for states that could lower the number of illegitimate, their words, not mine, births, of course, without increasing the abortion rate. So anyway, despite Bill Clinton's marriage promotion programs, by the 2000s in the US, just 59% of children are born to married mothers, in contrast to the late 50s when 95% were. So the family is, as people have already said here, falling apart due to material conditions. And it is the working class who is bearing the brunt of all of this, right? So one of the things that I am fascinated by is the number of working class women who are now making decisions, like this one woman who told researchers Naomi Kahn and June Carbone, I can support myself, I always had, I can support myself and our kid, I just can't support myself, the kid, and him, being, of course, the father of the kid. So as Michelle was saying, the male breadwinner is falling apart, and these women are not really interested in taking over. So the coronavirus is a whole other set of things that I'm sure we'll get into in questions and answers. But I wanted to take my last couple of minutes to play with something that I've been thinking about and threatening to write about for a little while. For a little while on the internet in the last year or two, the hot topic was heteropessimism. And this conversation around, is heterosexuality doomed? Indiana Saracen at the New Inquiry wrote, heteropessimism consists of performative disaffiliations with heterosexuality, usually expressed in the form of regret, embarrassment, or hopelessness about straight experience. Heteropessimism generally has a heavy focus on men as the root of the problem. That these disaffiliations are performative does not mean that they are insincere, but rather that they are rarely accompanied by the actual abandonment of heterosexuality. End quote. So we're all sort of aware that something about the way that we're still sort of expected to couple is fucked up, but what is it that's wrong exactly? I've been threatening to write theses on the wife guy because a lot of women who date men my age and younger have had the experience of dating somebody with super radical politics right up until he wants a wife. So what I want to say is that I think in addition to all of the material conditions that we need to be talking about when we're talking about the family, I also want to suggest that a politics of family abolition can be a way to interrogate what's actually wrong with heterosexuality. Because much as it's fun to blame men, I actually don't think that's fair. I actually think that the long history of the family and all of these expectations that are piled onto what Michelle was saying so lovely, as the actual bonds of care that we make and want to make with one another. And we still have a hard time imagining heterosexual relationships that are not basically shaped like a marriage. So yeah, I want to wrap up, because I'm out of time, by saying, returning back to the people in the streets, to the rise again of the term comrade, which was very much out of fashion for my first 15 years or so on the left. And Alva Gottby, who was on a panel on the family at a conference that Kathi and I were at in September, who said, family abolition is a politics of friendship. And my brain kind of went, oh. So I have no answers any further on this front, but I have a lot of questions.
Thank you. What a lovely way to end in the context of a panel. So I am now going to turn it over to Sophie Lewis.
I too want to sort of open by paying tribute to those rioting in Louisville and Minneapolis in the name of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and urging our collective solidarity and material support for the abolitionist and care collectives on the ground, such as Black Visions and North Star, trying to get people free during the pandemic in every sense of the word of free, and by any means necessary. And it's, of course, kind of deeply appropriate to be talking about the abolition of the nuclear private household in the midst of this explosion of comradely Black rage and love. If there were such a thing as real family, in the sense of a dialectic of real families against the family, it's here, to be sure, that we might glimpse it in the neighborhoods destroying what destroys them, that is to say, police precincts and condos. In the practical tear gas related solidarity flowing in from Hong Kong and Palestine, and in the distribution hubs for looted goods that are enabling people to have and share for once, for free, some objects they desire and want, and which make life pleasurable. As has been expressed more or less anonymously in the annals of riots, past and present, the burning down of living situations that are so poisoned by white supremacist violence, they do not support mere renovation or retrofitting, can be seen as family abolitionist, not just in the sense in which they defy what Kathi calls the family ethic and the work ethic, defy family values, moral productivity, and property sanctity, but also in the sense that destruction of the infrastructure of destruction constitutes a real form of mass self-care, a risky expression of grief for a beloved stranger, which kind of, again, dialectically is what that word femme can kind of conjure. rather than a member of one's kin group, and a practice of unlearning domination, which for Audre Lorde was another way of saying learning to mother ourselves collectively by refusing motherhood, amongst other things, motherhood as an institution of moral blackmail and individualizing discipline. So moreover, it's Black radicals such as Hortense Spillers and Lorde and Christina Sharp and Saidiya Hartman and Alexis Pauline Gumbs and Indigenous thinkers like Kim Tolbert, who have, educated the left on this subject, not that we want to listen. For instance, on the liberatory valence of polymaternal mothering against motherhood, or the anti-Black and colonial character of the logic of bionuclear familiality, and the idea that children do not belong to anyone, in the phrase of the Sisterhood of Black Single Mothers. So like binary gender, from which it is inseparable, the ideology of dyadic parenthood and propertied nuclear kinship was invented in the image of whiteness, specifically to enslaved and colonized forms of life. And the polemical way of saying this is that the phrase the Black family is an oxymoron, and that in America, at least, there are only Black families whose survival against all odds showcases the inconvenient reality that kinship, for what it's worth, is always made, never given. It's wonderful, I just want to say, and not at all given, that Red May should schedule a panel on family abolition. It feels a little bit like we, and I guess by that I mean the queer communists, have a foot in some kind of door. As I see it, over the past few years, a small number of trans liberationist Marxists, mothers, queer utopian thinkers in various different lands and cities have started raising up again this banner of this centuries-old slogan, abolish the family. And then we found one another. And so a small but non-negligible resurgence in family abolitionist desire seems to be in the air. I also want to just note that there have also been efforts at recuperation of this already. I mean, it's difficult to gauge the response that our efforts have had in the culture at large, but liberal pundits from The Guardian to The Washington Post are suddenly publishing superficial criticisms of the nuclear family. And there was an incredibly racist 9,000-word piece entitled "The Nuclear Family Was a Mistake," published in The Atlantic by the New York Times columnist David Brooks in February. There are just a whole proliferation of these. They're all neoliberal calls whose fiscal motives are not hard to parse for a return to the extended family premised on marriage. And I could go on more about that, but even among those in better faith than David Brooks, and this is why I wanted to note that it's great that Red May scheduled us. Even among those in better faith, there is much incredulity, disagreement, and horror, particularly among straight and cisgender people, whatever their politics, around the content of this project, the meaning of both words, family and abolition, and the nature of the world conjured by that horizon. Abolish the family is a proposition that really triggers genuine trauma and brings out the most snarlingly defensive reactions and misreadings, not merely on the white nationalist right, but yeah, widely across the left, including in a very strange review of my book in Jaffe. I want to narrow down my standpoint really quickly by remarking that personally, I've always regarded family abolition as simply another name for reproductive justice, another name for queer Black radicalism, another name for communist feminism, another name for children's liberation, another name for wages against housework, another name for the Cyborg Manifesto, another name for queer insurgency, not to mention actually the National Welfare Rights Organization, which I believe was a family abolitionist organization. To abolish the family is no more and no less than the simple albeit as yet partially unthinkable creation of a world in which, and this is a phrase of Michelle's, no one is bound together violently any longer. So it has nothing whatsoever to do with, to quote the Jacobin Review, tearing children away from their parents and parents away from their offspring. It's got nothing to do with expanding the commodification of hitherto uncommodified arenas of social life. Yeah, the critique of the family has many, many prongs, including the rejection of the fiction of genetic reproduction and the sociological observation that the endless multiplication of individual kitchens and laundries is, amongst other things, deeply unsustainable and maximizing of labor burdens among the feminized. And the statistic that the vast majority of many categories of battery and abuse and violence take place amongst family members and within the supposed sanctum of the home. But the thing to stress, I think, about our critique, and this is sort of beautifully already been said in myriad different ways, is that it really is, you know, critique, not criticism. It's recognition that the family is simultaneously an anti-queer factory for producing productive workers, rife with power asymmetries and violence, and the sole source, or what we experience as the sole source of love, care, and protection against the brutalizations of the police and the market, work, and racism that many of us have got, again, or think we've got. So yeah, as Kathi and Michelle have particularly stressed, this movement of family abolition is dialectical, a movement of positive supersession from below, an extension of that which is good in the practices of actually existing proletarian love and care to everyone, regardless of how they live and love. And, you know, that's of course part of what I was trying to do in my title, Full Surrogacy Now, which is intended to be simultaneously a description of the dystopian character of the present state of things, i.e. there are always myriad, you know, surrogates constituting that supposedly autonomous organism, the white nuclear family, these racialized, feminized labors who are, in another phrase of Kathi's that I like, excised from the family portrait, you know. And at the same time, it's a call for the gestational commune, by which I meant the world in which humanity would not be blackmailed into mistaking a very limited number of legally sanctioned individuals for their only truly dependable sources of care and companionship in life. The world in which we had actualized the knowledge that we are the makers of one another, quite literally, and had learned to collectively act like it. 1 second, I just wanted to remark polemically that while treat your neighbors as family is a popular and well-meaning sentiment, particularly in the experience of the pandemic, and it's also the slogan of David Brooks's social fabric project, which is called Weave, trademark. I want to submit that in a dialectical movement, we experiment with, you know, thinking of this phrase as completely wrong. If we want to make it into the next century as a species worthy of the name human, perhaps we will have to do much better than treat neighbors as family. After COVID, if there is such a thing, my hope is that we will treat each other, everyone, including our official mothers, with all the intimacy and tenderness that is due to strangers, or dare I say, comrades.
Thank you all so much. Yeah, so I'll just start. I mean, at the risk of, you know, volleying something into the void that is Zoom. Are there any questions or points of connection that come to y'all's mind that you'd like to pose each other before we open up to the sort of general Q&A? Well, if not, I have a question. So I think, so we've got a couple questions coming through. And I think this is my favorite one, and so I'm going to start with it. And I think you could take this as a chance to knock down the greatest haters, or as a chance to sort of open up a bit more what you mean in this theorization of family abolition. So what are some of your favorite as they say, bullshit positions, you hear from socialists and communists in defense of the family form. And what are these comrades missing? So I think a couple of you have gestured to the ways that some people react to the call for family abolition, whether it's a slogan or an in-depth book, but I'm just curious, what are some of the responses that you've heard? And what do those responses like tell you about the state of thinking or the state of people's actual lives?
Should we all riff together? I mean, we're going to have a lot of awkward pauses because there are so many of us. I'll just throw out that it's an extremely important, question to deal with. First off, for example, the question of racialized families against the colonial state. So, in one of my first airings of this, of this idea, a lot of people were pointing out that at that moment, this is the image conjured in Nivedita Majumdar's kind of objection, children being torn away from parents at the border, right? The border from Mexico to the United States. So the idea there, and which needs to be dealt with very, non-defensively, because it's crucial and it's central. This is not a question of, somehow implying that like the racial colonial capitalist US border regime is practicing family abolition somehow by not respecting the kinship bonds, or in fact implementing DNA tests to sort of check for biological genetic status between migrants, as though, the fiction there being that were you to be confirmed as sort of biologically legitimately tied to your co-travelers, then the United States would be forced to sort of honor you as a family, as though that is actually how it works, right? And it's the opposite. I would sort of submit, but this can be done too glibly, but I would submit that in fact it's precisely part of the regime of the family that there be this kind of underclass and these surplus populations that are not dignified with the sorts of affordances and privileges and rights that come supposedly, but to everyone, but in practice only to a particular kind of class via the sanctity of family.
Yeah, I would just add to that, because one of the most interesting things about those people who are crossing the border is how many of them end up doing paid reproductive labor in the US, and how Laura Briggs's book is excellent on this point, right? Where she notes that so many people are already leaving their families behind when they come to the US, because the people who will hire them don't want a family in tow, right? So if you want to live in nanny to care for your family, you don't want her to bring her 2 kids. A woman I spoke to for the chapter in my book that is on paid domestic work, when the coronavirus started, she's a nanny, and she was just a 9-to-5 nanny for this family. But when the virus started, she moved in with them and her kids. Her kids are a little bit older, so it was easier for her to leave them at home, but she's choosing to care for this other family because it brings in money, because the other, choice with big air quotes around it is not get paid. So, we have a system that already only respects the family relationships of some people. So that kind of argument. The other one that I love, actually, which was in my notes, then I skipped over it because I was taking too long, is, the argument that I'm sure will be leveled at all of us here, that we are, academics and journalists and, bourgeois, blah, 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 pretentious academics throwing around big words, and the actual quote unquote working class wants nothing to do with this, which is why, of course, I spent so much time talking about the welfare rights organizers. And I really love in Michelle's endnotes piece, the history of the different options and styles of living together that the working class has had across history when not being sort of forced back into the nuclear family.
Kathi or Michelle, did y'all want to weigh in on this question? Sort of like common critiques or responses you get, what they illuminate for you? So to move on. So Kathi?
I guess, so I'm thinking about like some of the responses that I've gotten, and some of this comes from, I'm interested in academic feminist work on the family. And I think, some of the pushback that started in the 80s and then really took off into the 90s against the kind of family abolitionist project that I'm interested in was all wrapped up with an academic turn to the subject, where you always wanted to look at the subject, right? And this is a real structural project, family abolitionism, at some level. I mean, you're actually looking at kind of large social patterns and social structures. And there was a kind of academic move across a lot of disciplines in the late 80s and into the 90s and then beyond that really wanted to focus on the particular and not the general. Like, well, so what are different people's experiences in families? Let's try to dig down into the differences among people's experiences and what those families mean to them. And don't talk about these general kinds of structures. And then instead of talking about structures, look at the agency of people within families who are not just sort of the victims of these social kinds of forces. So there's a whole series of academic trends that militated against looking at the family as a larger kind of social pattern or institution and larger kinds of ideologies. So I think that was a general problem. And then the way that I've gotten that it shows up in kind of political conversations is that some people interpret the call to abolish the family as an individual ethical mandate. Like, leave your family, don't want what you want, leave the couple, and that's never been what it is. It's a political project. And as a political project, it's a collective effort to try to change some of the rules of the game that have shaped some of our, intimate desires and intimate practices. So it's a larger, it's a different kind of scale of analysis. And I think some people aren't used to, because again, this subjective term, we're really used to thinking on different scales, an ethical scale about how individuals should act in their own lives and the differences among individuals, all of which are important. But it's come at the cost of being able to think about certain kinds of general patterns that impact people differently, of course, but also have a pretty powerful effect on some of the patterns that we see in the world. So those are the kinds of critiques that I've gotten that I'm starting to get frustrated by.
I think that also gets at my frustration with the heteropessimism discourse, which is like, it does make it into this privatized thing. Like, the solution to the problem of being heterosexual is that I should just choose not to be. And that leaves out all of the social factors and the whatever factors and one's individual desires, whatever those might be, and makes it into, again, a sort of personal ethical injunction to behave a certain way, and then one's sex life is somehow inherently radical. And that just doesn't work.
But, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Michelle.
I think, anxieties about family abolition come from a lot of different places. Some of them I think are really deeply psychological for people. Some of them are these issues of white supremacy and racial capitalism that I think a few of us on the panel already spoke to at some length, and we can say a lot more about. And part of it is that there is actually a deep set cultural, sexual, gender normativity and narrowness that's a part of the history of the left and the history of socialism. So, a lot of what I'm interested in historically is this unfolding tension over time. Particularly, I look at the Second International and some others between sort of trajectories. It's 7 o'clock here, so everyone's cheering outside. Trajectories of family abolition and trajectories of really seeing the family, the bourgeois nuclear family, as an achievement to be won by the workers' movement. That like the proletarian movements hated and despised the bourgeoisie, correctly recognized the destruction of bourgeois society as the foundation of communism, and then there coalesced the right kind of economic conditions, dynamics in capitalist development, political conjunctures, political organizations, and it became possible for proletarian people, for working class people, to emulate the bourgeoisie, to have a housewife, to stay at home. And this was an answer, it proved to be an answer to a profound question of social reproduction, the very high rates of infant mortality, the very high rates of there was a huge crisis of working class people in the factories dying before they were able to generationally reproduce themselves. And like the despair of living in these early industrial slums is really well documented. I mean, it was so nightmarish, and people needed a way out of that. And for a while, it seemed like the way out of that might be revolution. And the way out of it that they found for some, it was only select tiers, was the bourgeois nuclear family, or an emulation of it. And that sort of sense, and that because capitalism is always destabilizing our lives, is always fragmenting our relationships, is always eroding our capacity to live decent lives, that we are continually drawn back into this form as a necessary means of protecting ourselves from the horror of wage labor. And so this gender and sexual conservatism of the socialist or labor movement is sort of built into the dynamics of wage labor. And it's only in a context, I mean, there are all sorts of beautiful chosen kinship relationships that people develop in the world, but the ones that interest me most, and Sophie alluded to this in the riots, are the ones that people develop in the course of very high intensity struggle, because those are points where the role of the state, the role of wage labor, and the role of the family simultaneously break down, and the possibility of new systems of care that are barely even imaginable to us in our day-to-day circumstances begin to emerge. And that's the sort of, I think of a family abolition not being a sort of series of reforms that are possible within capitalism, although there are plenty of reforms that we should implement or fight for right away, like welfare expansion of cash transfer benefits, among many other things. But family abolition as something that can only occur in the course of an unfolding revolutionary process.
I'm being greedy, but I wanted to throw out a couple more things, if that's
Please,
okay.
yes.
Like, it seems to me that, like, listening to everyone, it reminded me, I've had the experience over, 15 months of sort of pushing my ideas of really so my first response to people's objections was to really actually tone down the scariness. So people go, oh my God, don't you, like Kathi said, you're coming for my family or whatever. And I would obviously be like, no, you completely don't understand. This is a structural, but actually over time, it's funny. I realized that you can go a little bit too far down that route. People are scared. And I in a sense, it's true. I am not coming for your husband and your children or whatever, scary, queer feminist. But actually, if we cede too much ground in the kind of with the aim of not being scary, then I think we end up blurring the distinction between our communist project and the kinds of takes that, as I pointed out, are now proliferating somewhat for interesting reasons that I'd be interested in discussing. Like, could we discuss the reasons why a sort of centrist and liberal feminist discourse might appear that talks about how insufficient or fictional the nuclear family is, so as to short circuit a more revolutionary feminist kind of structural critique of the family? And what is the difference? Does it boil down to sort of the primacy of a kind of marital biogenetic prosperity ensuring legal bond, or what does it depend on? But, you know, and the other main thing, and I've noticed on the YouTube channel, a very, very common question and anxiety is just about that word abolition, which we didn't fully necessarily unpack yet, which I believe we are all using and implementing in the sense of, you know, Ruthie Wilson Gilmore's prison abolition, which she patiently, you know, explains is not about the simple negation or destruction of particular infrastructures or practices, but on the contrary, a building and a proliferating and a kind of growing of the world in which prison and relations of carcerality are unthinkable. So that is important to say. You know, abolition gets heard as sort of a taking away of your children even, right? And that's hugely triggering for, in particular, in fact, racialized populations whose children get taken away systematically by the capitalist state. But it's on the contrary about extending the experiences of proletarian love and care that we have found, despite and against everything, you know, to everybody in a non conditional and non-compulsory way. But, you know, I think we need to understand how unthinkable it is for many of us. And I mean, I think I include myself in this, to imagine, you know, a non-Oedipal subject, very difficult to imagine, a world of true abundance and provision, very difficult to think about, and it's scary. The unthinkability of a world where children are subjects and participants in our politics, and in relationships. You know, these are some of the, so they're not my least favorite objections, but they, you know, they're real. They're real.
I want to say a little bit about abolition. So I use abolition in this really precise Marxist sense that he takes from Hegel, comes from the German word he uses, that it's simultaneously to destroy, to lift up, and to preserve, that it's all three. And they're one word in German. It's fascinating. And that's what Marx means, right? And so I think of that as a breaking open of the family to free and unleash what's good in it, and to generalize that, as Sophie said, into this social body as a whole. So to make the necessary forms of care available to everyone unconditionally. And for a little while, I thought that this sort of German word abolition was in contrast to anti-slavery abolitionists in the United States. And for a little while, I was like, well, it's a problem of translation and got to explain it. And actually, W.E.B. Du Bois spent a lot of time studying Hegel, and he was very interested, and he wasn't the first anti-slavery abolitionist to do this, very interested in how the abolition of slavery would require the creation of new institutions of Black survival and Black flourishing, and that process was simultaneous. It is both a destruction and a freeing of Black people's capacity to care for each other and reproduce themselves and to work towards freedom. And that abolition has this tension that is sort of linguistically there in the German, but also there in our own legacy, that it's a freeing, an unleashing, a generalizing, as well as a destruction.
On that note, it makes me think of Tara Hunter's amazing book, To Enjoy My Freedom, which is about Black women, domestic workers in the South after abolition. And it's about their work and the first washerwomen's strike in Georgia and many other things. But it's also about the ways that they found, even in these horrible working conditions still, to enjoy their freedom and to make relationships. And it's just a beautiful book and everyone should read it. It also makes me think, because we're talking about abolition and we keep referring back to Minneapolis and to the streets, and I've been watching so many people on social media in the past few days sort of do this wonderful thing where they open up their mentions and they're kind of like, when I say police abolition, when I say prison abolition, does that make you uncomfortable? What makes you uncomfortable? I will talk to you about that. And it's been amazing to me, actually, there's always these moments when sort of things that happen in left politics world cross over into like my Facebook friends that I like used to ride horses with when I was in 5th grade or something. Literally a thing that happened today, where I see these people who I don't think would have any interest in this stuff suddenly posting about it, and posting stuff that is supportive of not just, you know, oh, peaceful protests are fine, but I wish they wouldn't, but people actually posting the Martin Luther King quote about the riots and really saying, like, we understand why people are looting. And it's funny, this brings me back to not a particularly family abolitionist gripe, but just a gripe with the sort of social democratic left writ large, which is that, you know, you can't say scary things because the workers will be scared. You can't talk about riots, or, you know, indeed, you can't talk about racism because the workers are always, you know, positioned as the ones who are going to be scared of this thing. And I think we get that same sort of projective identification with family abolition too, right? Where people will be like, oh, I understand what you're talking about, but the workers, they don't, and they won't. And so you can't talk about that because the workers don't get it, when the workers are probably living in an incredibly complicated family relationship already because capitalism destroys the way we live together.
Thank you, y'all. Yeah, I mean, I was also just thinking, Michelle, like you brought up the abolition of slavery, and it seems like even the word abolition has been sort of hijacked by this white supremacist understanding of abolition. Like, abolition worked because we got rid of slavery, so it's only imagined in that sort of negative sense. It's helpful to rethink it in that way. There were a couple of questions about sort of kind of the concrete world that we might build, but I want to reserve the sort of maybe last half hour for some more of that. But I want to think a bit more about this concept and how y'all are thinking about this. So one of the things that I noticed that comes up in this is, like, I don't know, on the one hand, everyone seems to be on the same page, or seems to sort of like jive with each other's analyses. And also, like, what the family is not necessarily always the same in these critiques. So there's some critiques that call for family abolition that very much focus on the family as an economic unit, right? The household as that side of like privatized care. But then I think, to get to Kathi, you laid out those 3 pieces, that couple form, that biokin piece, you know, getting at forms of gender and sexual normalization that happen in the family. I mean, I'm curious if y'all see, like, how do you see sort of like threading those two, or do you see examples where one gets held up where the other doesn't? I mean, I can imagine a socialism that tries to deprivatize the family, but still holds on to a very heteronormative model of the family, and maybe whatever the vice versa of that would be. So I don't know if that speaks to anyone, but I was just thinking about that sort of the kind of the normative family versus the economic family, or however you want to call it, and how those two are threaded together in your thinking, in people's everyday practices.
Well, I'll say
or we can totally move on and that's a dead.
No, we just got to process. We're processing.
Yeah.
Just takes a second. Yeah, I mean, I laid out those 3 elements, and, you know, so the couple form, you know, biokin, and the privatized system of, you know, care, social reproduction. And, you know, when I'm feeling cranky, I'll say, you know, the privatization of social reproduction is the base and the rest are superstructural, but it doesn't actually work that way. There's a really complex mutual imbrication of those 3 elements. But I do think that the privatization of social reproduction is somehow I think that's the material sticking point where a lot of interests are involved in maintaining this. And I think that there's more sort of flexibility and experiment that we've seen over time with the couple form. The biokin, that's, Sophie maybe can talk about that. That's pretty sticky too. But certainly the couple form is, you know, in some ways it's been kind of more flexible. And so we've had different experiments, you know, so there's, obviously, gay and lesbian marriage, well, does that really change the dynamics of marriage? I mean, there's lots of debates about that. And I think it's probably more than just add and stir into the institution. I think, the shifts every time it gets extended, it shifts a little bit as new groups are kind of included into it in some ways. But then there's also the rise of never married couples. And I mean, I think that, the pattern of marriage and the kind of heteronormative scripts and gendered scripts that are so embedded in it, that in some ways, I mean, I think the rise of never married couples is almost the perfection of marriage in some ways, because it's been so assumed that you don't even need the ritual anymore. So I mean, I don't really think it's the end of marriage. It's like the perfection of it more than anything else. And then there's the experiments and, polyamory. And I think all of those are great. And it's a lot of interesting things too. But then, a lot of this is really sort of, Julian Obadiah talks about this sort of certain kinds of polyamorous practices are really about the kind of, the full realization of the sovereign individual who can couple at will without these additional kinds of burdens and can move in and out of these. And it's sort of almost the perfection of the liberal individual that is at home, right? And the family is the home for that liberal individual. And I think it's been constructed as such. And I'm not sure any of those experiments, as important as they are, really dislodge the couple form. So even the couple form, I think, is proven to be pretty resilient in some ways. But again, I just think it's a really interesting, complicated relationship between these three elements, all of which sort of rely on a kind of naturalization. So the naturalization of, biological kinship, sort of the naturalization of romantic love, and, the individual who is fully realized in those kinds of individual partnerships, naturalization, and, also that kind of privatization. And that happens with all of those moments of it too. So there's a lot of echoing of the mechanisms across these three dimensions too, although they each have their own kind of separate history too, and I think can be kind of disarticulated and experimented with on minor scales with each one. But I'm still impressed with how much of a package deal and how resilient those three elements are in their, the way they've been kind of articulated in this present moment.
My critique or my writing partially comes out of having spent the last 20 years in radical queer and trans subcultures, and where I think there's some really wonderful ideas about chosen family and alternative methods of kinship and alternative methods of care. And that's lovely. That's just lovely to see. And it runs into so many limits over and over and over again, that these sort of experiments and alternative ways of caring for each other run up against the dynamics of the labor market, people being forced to move, people running into severe hardships that their friends really struggle to take care of them in the face of. And in the history of the Black freedom movement, I think we see examples of really long-term strategies of survival that are quite rich and wonderful, and totally inadequate for in the face, as I've experienced in my queer and trans subcultures, in the face of what capitalism does to our lives. And this has sort of led me to think, okay, so if we are trying to form alternative methods of kinship, but we are continually being pushed back into the couple form in a variety of ways, there's a very strong ideological element to that, around a fantasy that if you find the right person, you're going to be okay. There's certainly a psychological element to that, but there is such a strong material logic to it that, like, we didn't spend a lot of time talking about in my queer subcultures. We didn't spend a lot of time thinking about how people's family wealth, how people's access to different kinds of labor market conditions, how the overall dynamics of the economy were really shaping and constraining whether we could form group houses or not, right? I mean, we didn't have an articulate language for making sense of this. So although it might not be true in most places, I just kind of assume that people will lead rich, beautiful lives if they have the means of doing so. And so I'm really interested in sort of thinking about this material dynamic of like, how do wage labor conditions push people back into this family form, force people to rely on this family form, and obligate the family form if you want to have a decent life at all. And given that the family form is so riddled with countless miseries that we have spent the last 20 years talking about in my life, if we can begin to think through what kind of material conditions could transform, that could begin to open up different kinds of romantic and affective bonds.
Yeah, I sort of come at this from the other end, which is that I've spent too much of the last however many years dating men, including, in a partnership for quite a long time with somebody who I'm still very close with, that sort of fell apart in a way after we had moved in together and, had this, again, as Kathi was saying, it was sort of the perfection of the marriage and that we didn't get married. And I told myself that we weren't married and that was a difference, but it wasn't. And when that fell apart and I wanted to leave, the only reason that I was able to do that, and I am a fairly successful now 40-year-old person, the only reason I was able to afford to do that was my father happened to die and leave me a little bit of money at the same time. And that kind of experience is still really, really core to all of that. And the way this went actually made me think of two writers who write about living with disability and making yourself lovable as a sort of requirement of being taken care of. One was Laura Ann Robinson and Caleb Luna, who called it being singled, like you're single not by choice. And if you are single and you have care needs that are anything more than like a completely able-bodied, able to constantly work, relatively young human being, you're screwed in a lot of ways. And it's very, very hard to think outside of any sort of formation when you're literally like, I don't have kids, I'm getting older, I'm single, who's going to take care of me if something happens?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult question, defining the family, because I think, like Kathi said, all these different components and logics seem so co-imbricated. Although I think I agree, it's fundamentally like the a core thing seems to be the privatization of all this, near infinite quantity of free labor. But like I'm also thinking a bit, and I don't think we talk about this very much and I'm not very well versed in it, but there's clearly this biopolitical requirement to be registered to an address, to have next of kin. And, we experienced struggles around these ideas during the AIDS pandemic. When someone near and dear to you, someone who is your comrade or kith or whatever you want to call it, that is in hospital dying of COVID, can you access them? Simply say, of course there are these terrifyingly brutal kinds of logics of exclusion that are real around sort of next of kin law, right? And I was listening to the Bad Gays podcast the other day, which was very sweet to shout out to me in an episode about Lisa Miller, who's she was a sort of she's an ex-lesbian who basically kidnapped her daughter, and her partner, who is now married to another woman, was legally completely not recognized as a parent to that child. So I would say, and I mean, I guess I was sort of prompted to speak a little bit to the biokin piece of the whole imbroglio. I mean, this perhaps is one of the deepest and most difficult pieces. I seriously contend, that the children we make with our bodies are not our property. this seems kind of maybe the hardest part. Of course, there are incredible parents everywhere, right? So this is what I sometimes try and talk about in terms of the xenofamiliality that can be within biofamilial locations. So just to back up a bit, xenofam, in the theorization of the xenofeminists like Helen Hester in her recent book, Xenofeminism, is that openness and hospitality to the strange. So xeno-hospitality is something that can, and this is the part that I want to add in a sense, flourish within, relations that the state recognizes as blood relations or whatever. So the equation Hester offers, xenofam is equal to or superior to biofam, needs to be taken really seriously, both parts of that. Yeah, I mean, I've also noticed in the discourse recently, perhaps because these times kind of evoke the apocalyptic and people really come out with their full, vigilante eco-fascist desires as well as their communist ones. The notion of one's kids and of kids as one's own really authorizes almost limitless violence in defense of them, one's wife and kids. There was this kind of really mainstream British journalist, she's horrible, Julia Hartley-Brewer, I think she has hundreds of thousands of followers, and someone was asking, what's your post-apocalypse special skill? And she said, a complete willingness to kill in defense of my children, or something, on Twitter. And it's like, oh my God, why are people, fantasizing clearly about doing violence in defense of their children, right? Like, since when are your children a sort of, well, I mean, clearly, since a long time, a sort of reason, an opportunity to do terrible violence to other people. And I seriously sort of think that that's actually part of how the ideological order of biological nuclear kinship functions, to sort of channel and privatize love. Yeah, I'm going to be sort of earnest enough to really talk about love that way, and to sort of to organize it so that it's not only kind of narrow and exclusionary of all of our other companions and species and so on in this planet, but also actually to kind of act as a safety valve and a kind of a xenophobic nationalist kind of organizing of your frustration and your violence sort of in particular directions as well, i.e. not upwards.
So we have a question, and I'll read the question kind of just broadened out a bit. So, will shelter in place undermine or reinforce reliance on normative family conditions relative to geographical location? And I guess maybe just generally, I haven't heard I've heard a lot of lefty critique about sort of what COVID means, but not about family abolition. So I'm just curious, like, what, in many directions, what COVID-19 in these current moments have made you think about, in addition to immense violence in defense of one's children?
So I've been wanting to write an article about the suburbs being everything that's wrong with the world for a while, and it keeps falling behind other things that I'm working on. But I actually feel like this moment is the one to bring it back, because I think there's something about this self-isolation that reinforces the logic of the suburbs, which is the nuclear family, the single family home as an asset, and the car, right? All of which are killing us in a variety of ways. And yeah, there's this thing where you are withdrawing into your little unit. I live with two other women who are roommates, which is an under-theorized position. But I think about like, okay, well, what if we get let off lockdown for a little while this summer and then we get put back on lockdown? Where do I want to go? And I do find myself spending time in my car. And so I wonder if this moment, in addition to sort of reinscribing women's roles in the home, and there was an excellent New York Times poll where like something like 60% of men said they were doing an equal amount of the work and 3% of women agreed. That was specifically in terms of teaching your children from home, but I thought it was still the, general housework rule was not too different in that poll. So yeah, there's a way that this can really reinforce these sort of retreats away from community, but there's a way also that these beautiful mutual aid networks that are happening all over the place, and Sophie and I both live in West Philly, which has flowering mutual aid networks everywhere, that can really mitigate against the isolation, right? And then I'm just thinking about, again, these massive protests. After months of being on lockdown, the desire to come out and be together feels so palpable in these crowds in the street right now. And so, of course, I guess what I'm saying is it's always both and, but yeah, I think it's something we have to be aware of, that the politics of this moment are going to be put a lot of different pressures on us in a lot of different ways.
I mean, Sophie has an essay on COVID-19 and family abolition. And very simply, there's just a huge number of people being terrorized at home, right? I mean, there's so many kids who are being abused by their parents at home, and there's a number of factors in that. They're not able to get to school every day. Everything's way more stressful. Everything's way more isolated. The kids have a lot fewer people to talk to, and we have increasing evidence in mainstream news and research that it's just there's this horrific, violent nightmare happening in a lot of people's homes, and then for many people with sort of like happy families, like this is a really miserable time, right? I mean, being stuck in the family unit entirely, and specifically the family unit of who you happen to live with, is really I think producing a lot of misery for a lot of people. And then something that interests me is that the sort of other half of this organizing care in the family is that it's not available to everybody else. So you have a lot of people living alone who are very isolated and very miserable and very lonely, who wish they have families in many cases. And then you have people living in collective institutions. And I'm really interested in collective living arrangements as a future communist society. But the collective living arrangements that people have right now, the collective social reproduction units that people have, besides a few queer group houses or whatever here or there, are prisons, nursing homes, homeless shelters, totally nightmarish places where a lot of people are dying. And thinking about those institutions, what about those institutions are leading to so much death? And there are some practical, logistical questions about disinfecting and airflow and stuff like that. But really, I think all of those are institutions where people who live there have no control or say over the administration at all. They have no ability to defend their interests, to collectively problem solve, to transform the institution according to their collective needs. And instead, they're subject to either intense levels of racialized violence or, being treated, infantilized in the way that the elderly people are, often by profit-making, profit-oriented nursing homes. And so in these sort of authoritarian institutions where people have no say over what they get to do at all, then that the conditions of death are just so terrible. So it's like on all sides, right? That people in families are having a rough time, people not in families are having a rough time, people in collective institutions are having a rough time. And if we were to stop and think about what kind of living arrangements could actually work in these conditions, where people could actually be cared for, could actually share resources, could actually watch out for each other, and be able to exert some collective democratic authority. And the glimmers of it are, which, they're not going to go very far, but are in these mutual aid practices. And if we were to imagine these strained commodity chains breaking down much more severely than they are, and these kind of mutual aid practices are beginning to actually try to figure out how to feed entire neighborhoods, and that requires control over land, control over industrial resources, like that these mutual aid networks in the context of a revolutionary unfolding or a revolutionary process could actually be alternative systems of reproductive care. That you can, that people knock on my door asking if I need anything because they're part of these mutual aid volunteer efforts, even if they don't really know me because I live in this building. And this sort of like impersonal, universal, and yet direct caring quality is really quite rich. And yeah.
So I think like a couple of the questions have kind of spoken to a little bit of this point of, so I'll read a couple of them. So, people are asking like, what kinds of new kinship practices and forms of life should we be organizing around and developing today? How should we live together? How might we be living together today? One person also particularly asked about the, how might family abolition change our architecture and our spatial design of our all our environments? So maybe you could just speak to that. Examples, and I'm also curious, examples that are sort of explicitly critical of the family dynamic, and ones that aren't, but still sort of touch on it.
I'll go. Thanks for shouting out to my article, Michelle. I've really, I suppose one thing to say is that, amidst the turmoil of COVID, there's an appetite for people like us, but a desire for the oracular thinkers of the home and the household are suddenly in high demand. I've kind of got the impression that a lot of editors under conditions of lockdown have personally sort of had the realization that perhaps even when it is free of queer bashing, domestic violence and penury, for example, the nuclear family or the private nuclear household perhaps really does still kind of suck. So who is it who has been talking about that for some time, and so on. But there is a sort of it's fun to speculate and to write futures where family abolitionism sort of begins to become more manifest. But I cling as a utopian to the definition of utopianism that has to do with the unthinkable, the necessarily not fully thinkable kind of character of what we are finding out through striving towards and beginning to learn about through struggling. So when an editor asks me what happens next, I kind of feel quite glib but excitable as well. I mean, will 2020 mark the beginning of the end of class society and markets via a general strike that leads to a giant archipelago of protest kitchens, which is one of Michelle's kind of notions for one of the sort of springboards for the experience of abolishing the family. And these might in turn lead to the overthrow of work and the founding of 1 million co-housing projects, co-ops and communes. Will all the cleaners and nannies and wet nurses and babysitters and gardeners and sex workers and cooks and au pairs and chauffeurs, i.e. surrogates, all move in with their employers or move into their choicest wings and add their names to the property deeds or the car insurance documents or the baby's birth certificates? Will children themselves be somehow empowered to advance their own liberation? I just want to remind everyone that the word we have for breaking up with your parents, your legal parents, is emancipation. And could children be listened to, platformed, empowered to emancipate themselves and develop visions of democratic transgenerational cohabitation? Will a vast new, federated institution of social care sort of spring up, which Jules Gleason and Kate Doyle-Griffiths envisioned in the terms of the creche, the transgenerational creche for people of all ages? So I feel like telling editors, yes, inevitably and without a doubt, yes, This is the future for the household. I also just wanted to quickly note, because this hasn't come up so much yet, that there are real bloody consequences that you can point to the presumption on the part of the biopolitical state that the nuclear household is the sort of operative unit in a pandemic. So there was an article in The Nation describing how in Black co-parenting households in particular were struggling, in particular in Chicago, to adapt quarantine recommendations to their specific situations. So there's this kind of sense we might speculate about that the very reasons for Black populations' survival against all the odds over time, i.e. their ability to kind of persist transgenerationally across different households and in non-nuclear ways, might sort of somewhat tragically be one of the factors behind the astronomically, the disproportionate Black death count under COVID, because we have not figured out, we are not able to think of a way of protecting one another and doing a way of sort of combating a virus that is not dependent on these logics of kind of propertied isolation or isolatability, right? A human is supposed to be isolatable, is supposed to be able to shelter in place, stay at home. Which place, what home, whose home, a Marxist might ask, being the more operative question, right? And so that's what I said in my in my article. Nuclear households are where we're all intuitively expected to retreat in order to prevent widespread ill health, and that how can a zone, I sort of said a bit polemically, defined by the power asymmetries of housework, of renting, of mortgage debt, of land and deed ownership, of patriarchal parenting and the institution of marriage, benefit health? Yeah, okay.
I guess I want to just address this question of alternatives too in another way, because I think Michelle's talking a lot in really important ways about these kind of prefigurative experiments and developing these into real alternatives and robust alternatives, and then the kind of speculation about what might happen. I think these are all really important exercises, and I would just add to it another one is that this gets down to just sort of more simple reformism that might be in service to a family abolitionist project, is trying to create the material conditions that allows people to experiment with alternatives a little bit more. And so, think about some of the coercive forces that push people into families and block the exits from them. And, I think there's ways to create the material resources for people to try something else, and a guaranteed minimum income could do that. Shorter working hours could do that. Time alone can help to experiment with other ways of providing and delivering care. Universal health care delinked from wage work could do it. Affordable housing with a range of different kinds of units for different kinds of groups or single people living together. I think these are all very sort of nuts and bolts reforms that might be able to give people some kind of basis from which they can more effectively experiment with other ways of living that they might want to try. So I'd add that too.
Yeah, it's easy for it to turn into just that same sort of personal moral admonition, right? To be a better person, be more whatever, choose not heterosexuality, all of those things, which are both very difficult. And then also, I think a lot of people are probably where I am right now, which is the thinking of like, okay, things look like they're lifting a little bit. Quick, I have to figure out how I want to live before the next wave hits. Is this where I want to stay? Is this, the roommates are lovely. I like my roommates. They're great people. We didn't move in together assuming that we were going to be the only people each other could see for 3 months straight. you know, and that's a different thing than moving in with a romantic partner, or even the folks that I live with when I'm in London, which is now not an infrequent experience, which is people who are a lot closer to feeling like some sort of family to me. Anna was my intern 10 years ago, and she has grown up into a superhero. And so when I'm with them, these are people that I have a long-term relationship with, where it feels more like home. And so, you know, a lot of these questions I think are probably coming up for people like very immediately and very personally right now. In addition to thinking about sort of theoretical political programs that we should be fighting for, also some of the political programs that Kathi was just talking about are things we can fight for in the here and now. Organizers are calling for things like work sharing to save jobs at places like the Los Angeles Times union actually won it. So everybody is taking a cutback on hours and pay so that nobody gets laid off. So, I mean, these are things that we are, you know, we each got a $1,200 check from the US government. That was in some way an admission that they can cut us all a check when they want to. So I think, you know, we're in this moment that is both awful and still is cracking open some possibilities. But these are hard questions, and the reason that people resist it so hard is that it does hit really literally close to home.
I just want to put in a pitch for the hard utopianism that I think the time has come to talk about science fiction and to envision all sorts of different ways of living, to put them out there, not as sort of systematic plans for people to implement as Fourier imagined, but as counterpoints that alternatives that are present is an historically conditioned, isolated, specific set of circumstances that we can transform, and envisioning sharing stories, brainstorming, talking about different ways of living, and then extrapolating back what kind of economic system would be necessary for doing that, what kind of social practices can move us there, I think is a very powerful exercise. And I talked about my 2 essays about family abolition. I didn't talk about my science fiction short story, which is an oral history with a trans woman at the 100th anniversary of Stonewall, because I run a trans oral history project and, you know, interview a few people a week about their lives. And so it's an oral history of me interviewing this woman in 50 years about her growing up in a collective commune and their architectural arrangements, what happened when one of her co-parents was abusive and how they dealt with that, and sort of transformative justice, the sort of different kind of world that she navigates. And I'm hoping to sort of do more of that. But I think it's a really lovely and very powerful exercise. And it's certainly not there to like intervene and struggle to be like, you're all doing this wrong. Like, it will only be figured out in process. But the more the process of struggle, of collective participation and mass disruptive protest and creation of a new life against capital, but that the more sort of creative, inspirational, dynamic conversations that we can be having every step of the way, I think the better. And that the sort of Marxist injunction against utopianism, I think, has ultimately done a lot of harm in atrophying our creative imaginations.
Where can we find this story?
Oh, it's online. It's published by Homenchurn. I'll put the link in the chat, and Sean can share it.
Well, I'm a little, and thinking about, so we have 10 minutes left. I both am sort of curious to sort of to hear from other people if there are sort of to do a little bit of this dreaming together. And part of me is also a little curious to think about like, what are the, like, I'm thinking about your history, Michelle, of sort of how movements that were family abolition in a way got sort of co-opted into, you know, poor solutions or false choices. But so I'll just sort of put that out there. If anyone wants to sort of dream big or think about sort of the movement building and what that might look like, whether it's explicitly family abolition or not. But yeah, other side of that.
we might have already done that one. I don't know. Does anyone have?
I mean, you know, one of the things I think about is also how in Marge Piercy's vision of a post-capitalist future in Mattapoisett, there's not only the option of automating your gestational labor in a brooder where all the fetuses kind of, as I remember it, I might have been extrapolating, but are sort of floating in a slurry all together in a tactile and interactive way. But there is also specialized parenting labor. Not only are there, you know, collective responsibilities for all children, but there are also specialized parents called kid binders. And I thought that was that's part of the dreaming, I think, for me, envisioning what it might be like to actually really sort of take seriously and perfect the art of comradely caring transgenerationally, and to take seriously the fact that some people are really devoted to doing that kind of labor, but simultaneously sort of distributing, because that's what anti-work means really in many contexts. In the context of care labor, perhaps anti-work means minimizing through distributing that the sort of the work of caring for one another.
And the example from Piercy also recognizes that parenting labor can be extraordinarily highly skilled kinds of labor too, and it does acknowledge that through those particular roles.
Exactly.
Mm.
Write your own science fiction novels. That's my suggestion. Just lots of them, and then riot in the streets.
I support this political program. I want to write fiction.
Yeah.
You know, I always love to ask people, like, what would you do after the revolution? Because, yeah, I went to journalism school because I realized that there was no way I was going to get a job if I did the MFA program that I had also been accepted into. And now you're making me think that maybe the fiction writing would be a much more useful political project.
I didn't know whether to say this or not. This is something I do too, so I'm not sort of like pointing a finger at all, but I was noticing, Sarah, you used that phrase, feel like family, and then you kind of revised it later on in your remarks to feel like home.
Yeah.
But I'm very intrigued, strategically, I don't, or tactically rather, I suppose.
Yeah.
Tactically, I am a little bit agnostic about whether to try and foster collectively a sort of remaking of our basic metaphors, that it is so ineluctable, so difficult to get out of. When we reach for a word or an image to describe feeling at home with someone, we say kin, we say family. Even when you spend all of your time thinking about abolishing the family, that's basically what comes up. It's sort of so deeply semantically ingrained. And you know, I was sort of, you know, serious towards the end of my remarks today when I suggested, you know, we could really try and turn this on its head. Is it, you know, do we want the world to treat one another like family? I mean, it is not a particularly good track record, family, how people treat each other within family. I would like something a bit better. What if we actually said, you know, no, that's specifically what we don't want. How about kind of trying to train ourselves in this science fiction inspired way to aspire to treat one another as strangers? And of course, that doesn't preclude intimacy and relationships of sort of significant otherness, right? it is perfectly delightful to form deep partnerships and intimacies and to fall in love. But the sort of the compulsion and the blackmail that sort of forces us to kind of remain privately isolated with very, very few such significant others is a problem that could only really be addressed in the most, totalizingly kind of revolutionary ways, unfortunately. So, this is kind of the communization theorist, pessimist kind of get out clause. It's like none of this can happen without the abolition of capitalism, basically. But it's also important to notice that the pandemic is not, for instance, it is underlining perhaps in generative ways the radical insufficiency of nuclear households as a mode of social reproduction. Yeah, I mean, again, in my article, I was quoting how, apparently in the early stages of China's experience of the epidemic, there was a 90%. So according the particular women's not-for-profit calculated that 90% of the causes of violence were related to the COVID epidemic that they were seeing. They were publishing kind of specific, COVID epidemic specific resources for victims of domestic violence who were finding it difficult to flee, because obviously a quarantine is a bit of an abuser's dream. So when we survey the scene of the pandemic, we should be trying to see what Madeleine Lane McKinley, who is another name, perhaps not one that's come up so far, but one that absolutely needs to be referenced in any sort of surveying of the scene of 21st century family abolitionism. She writes that households are capitalism's pressure cookers. So this crisis will see a surge in housework, cleaning, cooking, caretaking, but also child abuse, molestation, intimate partner rape, psychological torture, and more. So this is, it's far from a time to acquiesce to family values ideology. It's definitely not a time to forget about abolishing the family, because it's specifically now that refugees from the nuclear household are swelling in number, and their need is also, or our need is also swelling in character. So it's kind of ghoulish beyond belief that a certain tier of British feminism is kind of using this moment as an opportunity to kind of assert their right in the name of feminism to commodified domestic labor. I don't know if this is a controversy that I mean, hopefully you don't know what
I do.
Yeah. The great white British feminist assertion of the right to have your cleaner in a pandemic because feminism. But actually, this is the dystopian element of the current conjuncture that we probably need to be kind of alert to. I believe a lot of the ruling classes are highly aware that there will be a second spike. And on that basis, in preparation for that, I believe they are constituting in advance, as a precaution, the sorts of households with the kinds of labor that they are accustomed to, so that they will not be caught out in a second wave of kind of lockdown. And that we should strategize together about how to kind of contest that, even if only rhetorically, since we all seem to be, intellectual laborers. Yeah.
We saw that Martha Stewart had kept her gardener and her housekeeper and was referring to them as her detainees. Anybody? Oh, this is a thing, yeah. But yeah, I think the thing that I struggle with is that I don't have good language for any of these relationships that are meaningful in my life. Friend doesn't seem like enough, right? When I'm talking about the difference between the people I live with here and the person I live with in London that I've known for 10 years that, would take a bullet for me. It doesn't seem significant, but why do I reach for family, right? What is it that we mean by all of these things, and why is just friends the thing that we say, right? Like it's always just friends rather than, your significant other is presumed to be a romantic partner. But what if they're not? What if the most significant relationships in your life, this is like a parody of the Sex and the City question, right, was always like, oh, what if your friends are your soulmates? But it never actually let itself go there, right? So yeah, I think part of this whole process is thinking about the frameworks in which we put people into our lives and understanding what those relationships could be if we didn't just think of them as like, Anna is a woman who is in my life who is younger than me, so she's like my little sister, except for when she's telling me that I'm being stupid, in which case she's behaving like my big sister, which she does quite often. How do we think outside of these metaphors that are also very much not metaphors?
Well, it's about 5, but I do just want to give space if anyone wanted to respond to those last points. Well, thank you all so much. Yeah, I've been looking forward to this for many months, and it did not disappoint. So thank you all so much for your time and your thoughts, and whatever other word you would use for this kind of relationship. So thank you. And I'll turn it over to Philip.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for this conversation, which should not end. And so we'll find a way that it won't. Thanks individually to Michelle, and to Will, to Kathi, Sarah, and to Sophie. I'll call you my guest friends. The Greek phrase xenia, which is the root of xenophobia, is also the root of a kind of something that's more than friendship. So we'll see. That's all I can think of today. And to all our friends, to all our xenos, xenii, or whatever, out there, we have 3 more events this weekend. Tomorrow we have 2 events. At 1 o'clock we have the COVID crisis in the carceral state. And at 5 p.m. we have Ghosts of Marxism, Spectre, editors in conversation on crisis. And on Sunday we have Border Panic and Contagion at 12. So a lot of good stuff. Go to our YouTube page, Redmay TV, and you can read more about each one of them. And when you're there, click on donate and give us a little something. We only need $400 more to get over the 4,000 mark, which will get us kind of a third of the way to where we have to get to before next Redmay. And you can also do it on www.redmayseattle.org. Click on donate, and may the rest of your day be blessed. And we're off, I think. So